Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Dr. David Neuburger, a recently retired family practitioner from Seven Valleys, Pennsylvania. Dr. Neuburger, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Bill. Great to be here.
David, you just wrapped up 32 years in family practice as a traditional country doctor. I asked you on the show to share some of your experiences with us, particularly to help us understand how the practice of medicine has changed from the doctor's side. You and I grew up in the 50s and 60s when doctors still made house calls and many were independent practitioners. After surviving the rigors of an MIT undergraduate education, what originally attracted you to family practice?
Well, when I was in college, my original thought was to go into biology research, and I was actually most interested in large animal research, such as studying deer. Mm-hmm. But that was during the time when there were a lot of cutbacks in funding for that type of research. But I knew I wanted to be out in the country, and I looked at using my science background and realized medicine was going to satisfy everything I wanted. And that's why I went into that.
And why family practice and not a specialty?
Well, I always loved the idea of continuity. In college, I had always thought about living on a hippie commune, and I thought that idea of dealing with families from birth to death and continuity of care was a really prime thing. I had done some mentoring when I was in college, and there were certain aspects of any specialty that are very appealing. But family practice to me always kind of brought it home as the epitome of what a doctor is.
How deep in debt did you have to go to finance your medical degree, and how does that compare to medical students graduating today?
It's night and day. I went actually to one of the most expensive state-supported colleges at the time, which was Penn State University, mm-hmm. which was in Hershey. And at that time, out-of-state tuition was $6,000 a year. In-state was $4,000. One of my partner's sons recently graduated from there, and tuition is now up to about $60,000 a year, and that's not including room and board or book expenses. That's just tuition alone. And if you compare that to the salaries, they haven't at all kept pace, which is part of why fewer people are going into family practice. Just speaking general numbers, a graduate back when I graduated, which was back in 1979, could expect to make maybe $40,000 a year mm-hmm. to start, and now maybe it's $130,000 or $140,000 to start, which sounds like a lot of money, but you have to put into that how many years of deferred income you have and how much work. But the ratio on tuition has gone up over 10 to 1, where salaries have gone up about 3 to 1. So not at all keeping pace with the cost.
So how can medical students graduating deep in debt even afford to go into family practice instead of studying for a more lucrative specialty?
The fact of it is that more and more of top-notch people look down on going into family practice if for no other reason than they can't afford it. We all know about the big problems that we have in the United States with undergraduate costs. And so a lot of these students go to private colleges, come out $200,000 in debt, and can easily take on another $200,000 or $300,000 in debt. So your question is appropriate, and we're not addressing that in this country at all.
Well, who's picked up the slack with fewer and fewer native-born Americans becoming GPs?
The numbers are hard to find, but I do know the numbers in that back when I was going into my residency, which is 1979, the number of residency spots was somewhere around 30,000 in the United States for family practice, and over 90% of them were graduates from U.S. medical schools. That number is now less than 50%. Only 40% of doctors going into family practice actually graduated from medical schools in the U.S. It's phenomenal.
So without immigrant doctors, we'd be in deep doo-doo.
We're already in deep doo-doo because the number of residency slots is actually lower now than it was when I went. So we're producing less doctors now than we did when I was a resident, and less than half of them have gone to medical school in the United States. The rest are international medical graduates. And I would go on to say that of all the specialties in the United States, family practice is probably the one that is most appropriate to have U.S.-trained physicians in. And I say that not because international medical graduates aren't as smart, they are. But the cultural differences are phenomenal. As an example, I had one of the residents who's working under me was asking me what a patient meant when he came in and told him that he was puking my guts out all night. And he said, "What's puking my guts?"
So little things like that could make a big difference in an emergency. From a business perspective, the mix of solo practitioners versus group practice versus hospital-owned physician services has also changed quite a bit. Most of us know what that looks like from the patient side, but how has that impacted doctors' lives?
Well, the transition, and I can look back with a perspective for my generation, the decision point when I was in residency was whether to be a solo doctor or to join a group practice. And the solo doctors looked down on people joining groups saying, well, you're not there all the time for your patients. The group practice model, of course, offered a lot of advantages to the doctor. You had comrades you could ask questions of if you wanted to get a quick consult, what we call a curbside consult. You also had a better lifestyle. Well, today that's changed in that solo practice is essentially dead. It's too difficult, too expensive to even imagine starting. And so now almost all of the graduates are going into some sort of corporate-based, either from hospital or private type of insurance-based thing. Very few people would join a practice such as I was in, which was a private practice. So it's gone a whole football field and a half.
How many doctors were in your practice?
We now use the term provider because we also had nurse practitioners or physician assistants are in most family practices because it's too expensive. So we had a total of 7 providers, 6 of which were physicians, and one was a woman who had been in the military who was a physician assistant who did a great job.
Dave, we all know from talking with friends and from watching TV that residency used to be a real trial by fire. How has that part of medical education changed?
It's changed a lot as well. Again, it's almost comical to me when I look back at what we were given and what's happening today. When I started in my residency, my first year, we were on call every third night. And the older generation doctors said, you guys are a bunch of wimps because they used to be on every other night. My contract stated that I would work 8 to 4 with additional hours as needed. And I know that I easily worked 110 to 120 hours a week during my internship year. Today, there are now federal regulations, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's around 50, 55 hours a week is the maximum they're allowed to work. After night on call, they have to be given so many hours off. It's a lot more humane. On the other hand, I think it is more difficult to get the full scope of exposure that you need to get in a 3-year period during your residency. So it's got its good and bad.
It's also odd. I have a friend who's a heart surgeon, and he says the residents now, if they time out, they'll scrub out in the middle of an operation.
It's true. It's caused problems. And of course, there are residencies who flaunt the rules. I know someone who's in a residency now that they just openly flaunt the hour rulings. And on the other hand, there are times when it goes the other extreme where somebody's in the middle of something and say, hey, I got to leave. It reminds me of a friend who took a cross-country trip on an Amtrak train, and they stopped in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa because the conductor had been on his limit of hours.
And I guess we're going to see a lot more of that when more and more doctors just become salaried employees and start working regular hours.
I think that's in some ways beneficial to the doctors, but detrimental to the patients. But it's the reality.
So after 32 years in practice, what would you say is the best part about being a family doctor?
There's no question that the interactions and the intimacy that you develop with patients, I really always looked at patients as being my friends and family, and that made it a lot easier to make decisions because I think if I could put myself and say, gee, if I were this person or if this were my family, what would I want done for me? And the ability to do that and have people open up about things that you just can't imagine. TV doesn't even come close to the intimacies that you're given inside the room with a patient. And it's a privilege and an honor to be able to do that.
You were in practice long enough to treat patients and then treat their children.
I always told patients that I was going to be willing to treat 3 generations, and after that I'd be too old. But the fact of it is, I had one family. I took care of 5 generations within one family.
Wow.
And they were all wonderful people.
So, Dr. Neuburger, helping patients and their families make end-of-life decisions is probably the toughest part of practicing medicine. What are doctors getting right about this, and what are they getting wrong?
Well, I think that in defense of family practice, we probably do the best job of helping people to understand. I recently read Atul Gawande's wonderful book on being mortal, which I highly recommend. My wife read it and found it very illuminating, and I read it and said, yeah, this is what I've been doing for 32 years. It was interesting because as a surgeon, he talked about how he suddenly understood that doing everything to everybody wasn't necessarily the best course. And I think family doctors have long understood that. We were all kind of taken aback when Obamacare came out and One of the good things in it was the idea that doctors would be compensated for giving end-of-life talks. And, of course, that became highly politicized with Sarah Palin calling it death panels. Recently, though, that has been reintroduced and will now be part of Medicare payment to family doctors starting in 2016.
It actually takes a lot of work to keep a hospital from providing inappropriate services at the end of life. I went through that with my former in-laws and my father when they would have kept treating well beyond the point where it made any sense.
Let me give you a great example of that. As a family doctor, our group also took care of our inpatients. So all the patients who were admitted to the hospital, we would be called and come in and take care of. One night I was called at 3 a.m. to come in to admit a person who had had a stroke. And I asked for some of the details, and they said, well, he was a demented patient from a nursing home who was 99 years old, and that he was in the emergency room and seemed to have recovered. So I asked, why would I want to come in to admit him? And they said, well, that's our protocol. The protocol is it looks like he had a mini stroke, and even though he looks better now, he should be admitted for a workup.
Wow.
And I was incredulous and asked, did you ask the family if they would want anything done at age 99 and he's demented?
Right.
And they said, well, no, we don't do that. It's our protocol that he be admitted. And I insisted that they talk to the family, and then I would come in if they wanted him admitted. And they, of course, said, no way. And he went back to the nursing home. But I know that many other internists who are the hospitalists would have just been there and would have done the admission.
Well, that could be a very lucrative patient for them.
It's really not about the money. I think it's really about protocols and not thinking and what we call cookbook medicine. I asked a friend of mine who works in the emergency room, why would anyone call me about a patient like this? And he said, well, it's a protocol. And I said, well, did anyone ever look at an age-related or health status-related addition to this, a modification? He said, well, no, this is from ACEP, the American College of Emergency Physicians.
Speaking of cookbook medicine and the reasons why it exists, let's talk a bit about lawyers, politicians, and insurance companies. Maybe not your favorite subject, but certainly a large part of practicing medicine. What's it like being on the receiving end of a malpractice suit?
Well, I thought I was going to make it through my career without being sued, but unfortunately, about 7 years before I retired, I was served a subpoena for a lawsuit on a patient who I had taken care of for over 25 years. It was fairly much a classic example, as they say in family practice, the number one reason to get sued is for an accusation of failure to diagnose a cancer, and that's exactly what happened in my situation. I met with my malpractice attorney, and the first thing he said was, don't take it personally. This happens to almost every doctor. And I tried to absorb that, but I remember exploding at the dinner table that night to my wife and said, the heck, it's not personal. It really is personal to me. You feel very pained that someone would think you weren't doing your best for them. And I always did my best for patients. The whole trial and situation was an extremely frustrating, though very illuminating experience. A friend of mine once said being sued was probably the worst experience of his life, but he's glad he went through it just to see what it was like. But I could not agree with him on that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how it all worked out?
Well, what happened was we had a full 1-week trial. They brought in expert witnesses who basically, to me, were paid whores. And we had our own paid whores who all presented, a very slanted side of something they really didn't know what happened because none of them were there. Their side accused me of being so incompetent that I shouldn't be allowed to take care of patients. And our side had a specialist came in who actually had testified in the opposite way on the same subject in a different case, unknown to us until the trial.
Wow.
And in the end, the jury came back and exonerated me. And of course, you don't use the word guilty, you would say liable. But then on a technicality, they appealed it twice and were turned down on both their appeals. And then they had a chance for a third appeal to the state Supreme Court, which was not accepted by the state Supreme Court to even hear it. So in the end, it took over 5 years to resolve something that ended up costing the system over $200,000, cost me nothing. My reputation is still intact. And I later found out that of all my physician friends, only one of them was not involved in some sort of a lawsuit during their career, though most of them had never talked about it out of embarrassment or just something they didn't think was comfortable to talk about.
It all ends up getting thrown into the cost of medicine.
Absolutely. And a lot of people said that it would change the way I practice forever. And I would say that it didn't, because I really never felt that I had done anything wrong to this patient. I felt sorry for him. but I hadn't done anything wrong. I had followed all normal protocols. I had talked about things with the patient. And I know that the jury saw that, and that's why they, felt that this was not a valid case. But I think that for a lot of physicians, it really does change things. They order more tests, everything is a CYA, and it becomes a way of practicing that I think makes medicine less fun and really doesn't protect you anyway.
Medical insurance has certainly changed dramatically since you began practicing medicine 32 years ago. Putting aside the patient financial issues, how has insurance changed the doctor-patient relationship as well as the way you practice medicine?
Well, now disregarding malpractice, just talking about it, I think, again, most family doctors and lots of doctors in America laugh at a lot of the politicians who are constantly talking about keeping the government out of medicine and maintaining doctor-patient relationship, when most doctors know it's the insurance companies that are really the obstacle, far more than the government is. The insurance companies now will dictate which generic drugs you can use, even though they're very inexpensive. They put you through what we call hassle factor in order to get tests done that you feel are important for a patient. They're really just hoping if they throw enough obstacles, you'll go away and stop doing things on behalf of your patient. We now have people who are hired full-time just to call pharmaceutical benefit plans to get medications approved that never were an issue before.
Just about every other industry transitioned from paper record keeping to electronic records a long time ago. Why has it taken the healthcare industry so long to adopt electronic health records, and why has this transition been so painful?
It's a very complex question that you're asking, Bill. I think that a large part of this has to do with the inefficiencies. Now, you would normally say, well, computers make things a lot more efficient. But the thing that's really hard in medicine is the data entry. Because we're kind of still in the first generation of electronic health records, the information input is so slow. I remember talking to the head of the emergency department residency at our hospital and asked him about how much time a resident spends putting data in for each patient. And he said about 30%.
Wow.
In my day, if you spent more than 5%, you were considered a slacker. But it's impossible to do it otherwise, or you're cloning records, which is copying records over and over. And so now we have progress notes that are 10 pages long but don't have any information in it. So I think that part of the problem is that you can't just hire data input people in family practice. The term scribe is being used a lot in medicine now, where a lot of specialists will basically have somebody next to them to input the data. And that works great for radiology and pathology and a lot of other specialties like that, but it doesn't work in family practice where somebody comes in because they have a headache, but the real reason why they're there is because they're being abused by their boyfriend or something else like that, and they're not going to open up when there's a scribe in the room. I think that in the end, electronic health records are what is going to make medicine work more efficiently, but right now we're in the very difficult early transitions of doing this. It will take at least another generation of doctors before this is fully in place and more efficient. It probably is the correct way to go, but for a lot of doctors of my generation, we really find right now that the electronic health records are a lot worse as far as relaying information, and that's not talking at all about the inefficiencies they cause in terms of time use.
Dave, Obamacare is the elephant in the room when it comes to medicine these days. As a doctor who's just checked out of the system, so you no longer have a dog in this fight, what's your prognosis?
Unfortunately, I think the initial lofty desires of Obamacare were dashed because of the political compromises that were made. I think that we have kind of extracted the worst of all systems, and unfortunately, it's doomed. There's no way that it can survive in its current form, and I think we're seeing that now. As a retiree now, I have to buy my own health insurance, and my insurance rates went from $10,000 for my wife and myself up to $15,000 this year. So what we're seeing is that the costs of providing care, when people don't really have the ability to control costs themselves, is just not going to work. And another way of looking at this is that we are a very high-tech society and we can deliver the best in high-tech care, but we do a very bad job of low-tech. My brother just had a heart valve replacement done non-invasively at the Cleveland Clinic. Couldn't go anyplace better in the whole world. But at the same time in Cleveland, there are single young mothers who are not getting proper health care for their newborns, or for their pregnancies. And we're not being able to deliver that. And unfortunately, Obamacare doesn't really remedy that because we've taken a large segment of patients who now have insurance, but they still don't have good access to care. Primarily, they don't have good access to family practice.
Dave, you're still a young man at 62. What caused you to retire so young when you could have clearly stayed at it another 10 or 15 years?
Well, I think that, again, in my retrospect, when I look at how doctors practiced 30, 40 years ago and what it's changed to now, the old doctors were always complaining how things used to be better in the old days. And I think that a lot of doctors in my age group are saying the same thing now. And I just never wanted to be a complainer. I could just see that new graduates coming out are only knowing electronic health records. They're only knowing this new world. And to them, it's the norm. Whereas to my generation, this has all been kind of an abomination of what we really set out to do as doctors. So I decided I'm only having one life, and I have a lot of other things that I want to accomplish, and I'm really enjoying retirement.
Dave, thanks so much for being on the show, and thanks for being my best friend since we were freshman roommates 43 years ago.
My pleasure, Bill.
That was Dr. David Neuburger from Seven Valleys, Pennsylvania, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.